Good morning. It's March 5th, 2019. Welcome to episode 11 of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. 6,000 years of extraordinary commitment to equal protection from a perspective of African statehood. We're talking about episode 11. This is going to be our third episode on Nubia. We're going to continue our discussion of Nubia and its place within the Nile Valley, its commitment, the features and dynamics within ancient Nubia or ancient Kush or even ancient Ethiopia. We'll talk about that later. The interesting dynamics and dimensions that to me prove that African statehood for 6,000 years expressed an extraordinary commitment to the equal protection of law. Here we're going to talk not just about equal protection, but also, again, a due process of law. And again, this idea of process making law regular, institutionalized, rather than ad hoc and just the whim of any one person. And to do this, what we're going to do today is compare the mythical nation of Wakanda that we all know from the movie Black Panther, and compare that to the governance structure of Nubia so that you can get a better understanding, more concrete, or be able to visualize what I'm speaking of when we're talking about matrilineality, matriarchy, and also other aspects of due process, including impeachment and power succession. How the right to rule pass one to the next, right? And so I've made a very big deal about matrilineal property and power succession, and I've made a very big deal about matriarchy as something that separates African statehood apart from the rest of the world for the last 6,000 years. And so we're going to continue that in this discussion or this comparison and contrasting of Nubia, ancient Nubia or Kush, and comparing it with the mythical nation of Wakanda. Let's start out with the first comparison. Let's start out with the first thing that makes Nubia very much like Wakanda, and that is natural resources. Wakanda was preeminent in the world for its vibranium, right? That was the story of the comic, that the mineral vibranium could only be found in Wakanda, and it allowed them to have resources and technology that were far superior to all those around it. Now, of course, the theme or the plot of the movie or the background of it is whether or not that vibranium should be used for either be kept secret and held within Wakanda, whether it should be used to help those affiliated, oppressed people around the world and create an empire, or should it be shared for around the world for more peaceful purposes. So different ways you can deal with this special resource that you have within your jurisdiction. Well, Nubia also had a very precious resource that some people in the world had, but nobody had any more of it than Nubia did, and that was iron, right? The metal, right? Iron. It may not sound impressive to us today because we're in basically the electric age, or actually the computer age. But if you remember back in school in history, they talked to you about ancient societies. They talked about a stone age, a bronze age, an iron age, and then that lasted for a couple thousand years, and then we get to basically the age of reason or the electric age or whatever. But the idea of being able to forge metal, take iron ore out of the ground or a mountain or wherever you could find it, any deposit, or mine it out of extract it from any place, and then forge it through heat into a shape or structure that was harder on its surface than just about anything around it. That I don't want to call it invention because I don't want to get into a debate about where iron melding or bronze melding and all that occurred first. What we do know is that Nubia's position in Africa placed it amongst large, abundant deposits of iron ore. Not only that, you have to have more than just iron ore. You also have to have the furnaces and fires to heat that iron ore to such an immense temperature so that it melts and that you can mold it, which means you also need an abundance of trees, right? You need an abundance of forest land to basically make these bonfires and furnaces to melt it. And so those are two things that were more that were present more so in northeast central Africa than it was in other places at the time. And therefore, this exploitation of iron, right, harder than bronze, able to chip and break stone, sets Nubia apart from the rest of the world, right? Especially the abundance of it. It was called the Birmingham of Africa at one point to correspond it or analogize it to late 19th century England as far as steel and iron production. I guess you would call it the Pittsburgh of the antiquity. So this iron. How does iron create an empire? How does it create this great civilization? Well, first of all, let's talk about internally. Iron being stronger than bronze or stone tools allows for greater amounts of agriculture, right? One of the difficulties when it came to exploiting all the resources of Africa, even for Africans, is the dense forest, right? Agriculture is the basis of what we might think of as society or civilization. If we're going to make a distinction between hunter-gatherers and those that hold down an area of land and govern it and take care of it. Again, that's what we're talking about with this territorial states, all basically tied to some common ancestor who's praised as a religion, as the dominant ethos or mystic of the state that holds it all together. So with the advent of iron tools, Africans are able to penetrate deeper and further and clear more ground, harsher environments. And so iron is very much tied to what's called the Bantu migration, right? The migration of knowledge and a ethnic group of people from basically the northeast and northwest parts of Africa. It seems that it went in several waves. And when we say several waves, people separate them into two, but I think Chancellor Williams is absolutely correct that again they're just overlapping over thousands of years, over hundreds and thousands of years of overlapping migrations from basically the civilizations of the Northeast, Nubia, Axum, Egypt, and also the civilizations of the West that we're going to talk about in episodes forthcoming, Nok, Ghana, Kanem. And so the iron technology that's mastered by those in these North Central African civilizations, then waves of people that migrate from there, and often for interesting reasons, sometimes often because of the infiltration of Asiatics, the infiltration of Europeans that put pressure on Kemet, on Nubia, on Ghana, and whatnot, that pushes the population further and further south with these iron tools that then takes over the African peoples that preceded them, right? Again, there were people there before that lived as hunter-gatherers, the Sao people or the Khoi, the people that speak in cliques, the Twa peoples of Central Africa, otherwise known by many as pygmies. So there were all these different types of ethnic groups and different peoples, and basically when we say the Bantu migration, we mean basically this iron technology and a common language, and these people that speak it and practice these customs migrating further and further south until the point you would get from Kemet, Kush, Kanem, and Ghana all the way down into Angola and the Congo, and then all the way down into Zimbabwe, and also culminating almost into a late 18th century empire called Monomotapa. All of it based on this, all of them having, as Chancellor Williams would argue, a common constitution, basically the Bantu constitution, which we'll talk about later. But it all starts from Nubia. Right, Nubia. This is how Nubia becomes the generator of what we would describe as African cultural unity. We're focusing on the legal aspects here. You can check out Sheikh Anta Diop and others for the other dynamics that I don't go into, such as cosmogony and other social practices, circumcision, and I mean, there's a whole list of things that are practiced within Africa almost ubiquitously, and they can be traced to ancient times. So agriculture and iron. Iron is a way to this iron being able to produce surpluses to cut further into territory is a way in which territorial states grew throughout Africa. But let's also speak just as importantly about iron as a weapon. So iron technology as a weapon, and especially a weapon that Africans had access to more so than other people at that time, but more so than Asians and Europeans and Mediterraneans did. Although Carthage also, again, we'll talk about Carthage later as an iron producing nation and the reason for its rise as a world power at the time. So having iron, while other people have bronze when it comes to a sword, when it comes to a bow and arrow, when you talk about the tips of bow and arrows, again, Nubia is known to, is called Tasseti, land of the bow. Right, they were world famous mercenaries based on the strength, but not only a physical strength, and the idea that Africans had this were tall and this strength, physical prowess, but also again for their mastery of iron and iron weaponry, especially archery. Know that Seti, again, Seti is land of the bow, but it also has a certain reference to Set, the brother of Osiris, the sons of Jeb and Nut, and under Ra, the god. So that's also an indication of how Kemet and Kush were related, and there's pretty strong evidence that Kush had priority, especially in time-wise, that the gods of Egypt pretty much came from Nubia. So this idea of having superior weaponry and superior agricultural technology go together, and it culminates, again, you know me, in tax collection. Right, the idea that since I have this iron weaponry, I can and it's superior also when it comes to agriculture and farming. The way in which an empire was created back in the day, the way in which we would control several provinces and tax them is through, again, this able to subdue them if they don't pay. Now we'll talk about some of how some of the Nubian kings were more kinder, sort of negotiated, were more apt to negotiate for another vassal state rather than to conquer it and lay waste to the people. Because again, the idea was not to slaughter everyone. The idea was to actually preserve the populace. The idea was to bring them all under one common authority, so that we can build great empire by doing this. If there's 40 some different provinces, they would all do 42 different things: weave cotton, produce copper ingots, produce sandals. This would be the craft. These folks would produce crafts or what have you. And under our authority, because of our weapons and technology, we're going to take an annual tour, the pharaoh and all our grandeur, the queen mother, the harems that sing and whatnot. We're going to make a big festival of this tour all around the provinces we control, and we're going to collect taxes while we're doing that, right? You're going to pay for the show. We're going to take a percentage of your sandals. We're going to take a percentage of the cotton. We're going to take a percentage of the copper ingots and whatnot. We're also going to give you back gifts is what they'll call it instead of requisitions or whatever. But we're going to give back. My power is also through my generosity, that the items that I've collected from these provinces get redistributed to all the provinces that don't have cotton, that don't have copper ingots, that don't have ceramics and pots and whatnot. So that way each province gives and gets, and it's through this a combination of iron technology, but also again this idea of religion, right? That who has the authority to do this? Who is the caretaker of the land, or the representative of the gods who own the land, right? You don't necessarily own the land. You have a right to farm it. You have a right to exploit it, but it's the people's as represented, as owned by God Ra or Amun. And the queen mother, the high priests or whatnot are those that represent it. And the importance of that from an economic perspective is, again, to have people willingly, voluntarily submit their taxes in praise of the common good or the common goal. Okay, so iron is Nubian vibranium. It is that which sets Nubia apart from the rest of the world and allows it to create an empire. When we talk about the 1,000-year run of Meroe, when Egypt falls to northern or Asiatic control, the Assyrians, Mediterranean control, the Assyrians and the Persians, or Mediterranean control with the Greeks and the Romans, that Kush rises as the premier state in Northeast Africa. There is also Carthage. Again, we're going to talk about Carthage. Funny thing, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but next to Carthage, all the way in Mauritania, Morocco, there's evidence right now, and I don't want to be conspiracy theorists or put things out before they're fully developed, but there's the argument that the ancient city of Atlantis, perhaps otherwise known as the quote-unquote Sea Peoples, that there may have been found a site or a port that corresponds to that's in Morocco or that may be where ancient Atlantis may have been prior to its destruction. But as far as the premier state of Northeast Africa, and one of the reasons why we say the premier state of Northeast Africa and give it such importance is because that's a gateway to not just the Mediterranean, but West Asia, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, all the way to India, and even as far as Sri Lanka, and then by the 3rd century AD, we're talking China. So this area where all these continents meet, now today called the Middle East, being able to control the provinces and all the travel. I can tax caravans and tolls, give tolls and taxes to caravans and other expeditions that come through the territory, again, otherwise enriching the state. What am I going to do with all those riches? Or one of the things I can do to hopefully control the people and producing those riches is also building monuments and other things and great public works projects. The good rulers do that. The bad rulers don't. And so societies or ancient African civilizations have gone up and gone down, have gone up and gone down, and have gone up and gone down. It's not entirely linear up. It's not entirely linear down. Okay, so that's Nubian vibranium. Iron is Nubian vibranium. But here is where I want to show where ancient Nubia, real African statehood, and its and those that followed, the states that followed it after the demise of Nubia, how their governance structures were different than Wakanda. Let's just basically say point blank, Killmonger would not have been eligible for the throne. Okay, Killmonger would not have been eligible for the throne. So basically, I'm sorry, you really wouldn't even have had much of a movie. Now, I'm sure we could have come up with something a little bit different, or we could have massaged it, but Killmonger would not have been eligible for the throne. Why? Okay, this is the different. Killmonger was the son of the king, right? He was the son of the king, apparently. And that's the thing. How do we know that? Right? Was there some paternity test or whatnot? How are we sure that he was indeed the father? Again, this may sound like a silly question or what have you, but when it came to the succession of power, this is real. Right, there's lots of folks can claim that the king had been with this princess or this woman or what have you. Again, when you talk about European history, you often have many fights over power succession based on the idea that either some noble or common woman son had a right to the throne. As a matter of fact, they would sleep with the gods, right? The gods of Europe would sleep with would have sex with regular women, making these half god, half men folks or whatever that would have rights to rule or superpowers. That wasn't so much the case in Africa. And the reason why is because of the principle of matrilineality. I'm sorry. What you're used to seeing was what Killmonger represents is again a patrilineality, a patrilineal system. The son, the oldest son of the king, or a son of the king, having a right to his father's legacy or goods or property. That is more of an Asiatic concept or a European concept than it is an African one. In Africa, again, it's the queen mother who property flows through, who passes legitimacy on to sons or daughters as far as lineage. So Killmonger would have to be the son of the queen, right? The son of the queen to be eligible, or one of the queen's sisters or royal sisters or some. There has to be something that ties him to a Wakanda woman, not simply the king of Wakanda. And as a matter of fact, that used to be very political, that going back and forth, ancient Kemet, ancient Nubia would even if a prince or a king married a foreign princess as a second or third or fourth wife, she still couldn't be the queen mother, right? Her children couldn't be the king or the queen king up next. Now again, there were times where maybe that was the ableist and we would adopt, that person would be adopted by the real queen mother. Or in periods of weakness, the foreign princess or the foreign power, the Persians or the Assyrians or whomever, may insist upon that child, the child of their princess who's been married to an Egyptian prince, should then rise to the throne. And Egypt did that same thing to others, right? Send us your princes, send us your princesses. And the children that they have after growing up in Egypt, Egypt would then do its best to have them installed into their local kingdoms, so that Egypt would have a friend, would have someone who basically grew up in the system. So again, let's start off with the idea that Killmonger being the son of a king does not make him eligible, that it's being the son of the queen mother, right, that makes that happen. So the idea that Angela Bassett, or I believe the character's name is Ramonda, her being on the run makes very little sense. The queen mother of an African nation being on the run. Now, first of all, when we go from one queen mother to the next, that is what we are describing as a new dynasty. So when we talk about the the generations or the dynasties of African dynasty, Nubian dynasties before Egypt, or if we talk about the over 30 some dynasties of ancient Kemet, what we mean by a dynasty is a new line of queen mothers, right? And so Ramonda being on the run doesn't really work as far as an African nation is concerned. And also, I guess I don't know if I should skip ahead to this, but upon his assuming the throne, let's say Killmonger does take the throne, usurp the throne. Stranger things have happened. Just because we're talking about what the typical state did doesn't mean that every state followed the same rules. It just is a generalization. But let's say that Killmonger does become, through power or whatever, the king. The fact that he does not appoint a royal mother, that he doesn't have his own queen, even a royal sister, right? In Africa, there had to be a woman on the throne somewhere. Again, going back to this idea of taxes, this idea of legitimacy, of connection to the gods that gave us this land, and therefore the authority to compel the people to give up a portion of it to the state. Where is the queen mother, or the god's wife, or the royal sister? You don't even care. Doesn't even You don't even have to be married. The royal sister could be placed in a position of authority, so long as there is a woman somewhere. So again, so let's start with this idea that a ritual test of strength is also unsophisticated, especially if we're talking about a nation that is far advanced than any other in the world at this point, with vibranium being this super fantastic resource. But then the who gets to be king is not a is a test of strength. We win that in a fight. Exciting for the movies, but no. And I hate to say that, I also think that it's fine for the movies so long as we know for a fact that that's not how it goes down, right? Because if we accept that for the movies, that's the truth, to me that suggests something, again, of unsophisticated peoples, right? No, we're not going to hand down power to large empires that govern major provinces on a fight. Right, who's the strongest? That's not how it goes. The Queen Mother, again, let's go back to the Queen Mother. She certifies, right? She certifies who are the royal princes and princesses that are then eligible for election to the position of king by the Council of State, which can include nobles. It can include Okoye, the head of the Dora Milaje, or the head of the army. It can include the vizier, the former the vizier of the state, the high court justices. It could include the priests, several priests, or the priesthood, the high priest of Amun, or whomever the god that's being church has been worked in some other part of the world, but of another part of Africa. But there is a council of state that basically chooses the king. Maybe that's not much of a choice. Maybe the royal family has such power that the council of state has to rubber stamp it, but that is what has to happen. The idea that someone just Killmonger just beats up T'Challa, and then because I win a fight, I become the king, is not satisfactory for me when it comes to a very, very important and technologically sophisticated state such as Wakanda, or back in the day, ancient Nubia. And through this certification and election process, through the Queen Mother, Shuri would have been eligible. Shuri is way more eligible as a royal sister, as T'Challa's sister. She is more eligible, assuming that she is the daughter of Ramonda, or one of some other aunt or royal cousin or sister, royal sister or something, that she would be eligible for election. Now, oftentimes, in order to get a female monarch, especially in Kemet, there was the fiction of choosing a child king, a babe who's not ready to rule, and therefore his mother, the intent would be basically the mother, Shuri, or whomever, would be the ablest to rule, and therefore to appoint her child, so that as the caretaker of the child, she could also become the queen mother of the nation and the de facto ruler. That's happened often. We're going to talk about Najmet, Pianki's daughter, as one. There's several examples. But at the same time, we're going to talk about ancient Nubia. There's this plenty of just queens that are outright named as monarchs. They are the preeminent ruler of the state, several of them. So Shuri would have been more eligible than Killmonger. And then let's end this by saying that once elected or once taken control of the state, he does not have absolute power. Again, it is great for the movies. It's very artistically compelling, but it is actually against history and a little bit harmful to believe that African societies were all ruled by iron-handed monarchs, all with with the power and voice of a god. That just wasn't the case in most times. And so a council of state, including Okoye, the head of the Dora Milaje, where she feels that she has to follow Killmonger's orders without question, that's just not the case. Yes, she's going to follow orders without question, but the council of the state, the priest, Okoye, the head of the Dora Milaje, the queen mother, to the extent everybody did not want Killmonger to rule, they could have ordered him to kill himself. It is a ubiquitous practice within Africa, no matter whether the king's power is small, whether it's great. The council of the state has the power to ask the king to order the king to kill himself. That is an impeachment process, is it not? Now, this could happen ritualistically or actually, or it could just happen symbolically. The king's charge is basically to go to the ancestors and communicate them the trouble of the day. So that's the purpose of killing the king and asking the ancestors for help. When we're really saying the king has messed this up, the times are terrible, this guy's ineffective, and we're getting a new one. But to save the face of the royal family and preserve the divine nature of the monarchy, etc., and all that, we're gonna sell the story symbolically as we're killing the king or impeaching the king so that he can communicate our troubles, a drought, an enemy coming upon us, so he can communicate that to the ancestors for help. And it's interesting that in Black Panther, they have something of that, right? That T'Challa, after being somewhat defeated, being halfway dead, it does in fact communicate to his father and the ancestors to receive help. So we're not here to bash Wakanda. We're not here to bash Black Panther. It was a great movie. We just want to point out some of the distinctions, and I don't even want to call them errors, because who knows? Again, not every state operated the same way, but we know how Nubia operated in a way that was distinct from Asian societies and European and Mediterranean societies, that corresponds to a greater commitment to equal protection, especially and due process, and especially as it relates to women, and in particular in this setting, matrilineality and matriarchy. So let's go through ancient Nubia or Kush. We talked about the A group and the C group and its pre-dynastic history and its early histories and the different cities and how they were established and how grand they were in the first two episodes. So let's just even pick that up, where we finally get to a known Kushite empire. Right? We go from its knowledge of its existence, knowledge that it is sophisticated, knowledge that it is a territorial state, knowledge that it probably predated ancient Egypt, its parameters, how far north and how far south it may have gone. But now we can talk more specifically and give you examples of different instances throughout its history for about a good 2,000 years where it becomes now the preeminent state in Northeast Africa in the Nile Valley. It becomes basically an empire, and we can see these principles in action that I just spoke to you about, that we can see queen mothers, royal sisters, elections, impeachments, etc. So I'm not just making this up. So let's go through a few. So when we talk about ancient Kush, ancient Nubia, and they're synonymous, we could break Nubia up into different peoples, the Medjay on the eastern side versus the Nahisi that are along the river, right? Both Nubian, but still considered two different types of people. One being more agricultural around the river, the Medjay being more pastoralist with cattle, and then we see them blending together as provinces and then again a state. And so as that is created, we know that by the Egypt's second intermediate period, we have Kashta, right, as one of the early kings of what is now known and called, even in Egyptian scrolls, in Nubian scrolls, and even again when it gets we're getting into now where the Bible exists, or Hebrews exist, right? We talked about the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. We're talking before there is a Bible, before there is a Torah and all that. And there's, again, strong arguments that those things even came out of or were derived from Akhenaten and others of the Middle and the New Kingdom. So now we're getting to a period where other folks like that are on the scene. We're into a much busier world, and Egypt is being impinged on from the north. Lower Egypt is being contested over between the African interior and West Asians. Again, Canaanites, Assyrians, Hittites, all that. And we see a unity, right? The new kingdom, what's striking about the so-called new kingdom of Egypt is that it is a uniting of Nubia or Kemet and Kush. Here in the 18th dynasty, before the 18th dynasty, again, before Egypt is a dynastic state, we believe that Kush has preeminence, that the gods come from, the Egyptian gods come from Nubia. We know that Narmer unites the north and the south, the two lands coming up from the south. But once Egypt becomes its own state, again, it seems like there's a tension between paper in the north and iron in the south, the two things that make Egypt special. Paper, metallurgy. It can get up all the paper and the record keeping and scribes, right? This is this government of scribes, making it different than bureaucracy, making it different and perhaps better than any other governments or anywhere else in the world. On the other hand, bronze, gold, copper, and then eventually iron coming from the south, and this tension of who gets to control Egypt, and by controlling Egypt, controlling the entire Eastern or Middle Eastern world, if you want to call it that. So Kush and Kemet become partners in the 18th dynasty. This is part of the greatness again of Hatshepsut in the 18th, her being the queen mother, the titles that she earned or carried, queen mother, mother of the king, mother of the nation, God's wife of Amun, first of the royal harem of Amun, right? All of these were to designate her preeminence as the royal woman for everyone to follow, not just in the monarchy, but also in the church, a unification of both political and religious spheres to give the greatest amount of authority towards, again, the collection of taxes. And so as Egypt and Nubia or Kemet and Kush are united together, and we don't know how far south. We know that trading extends all the way to the land of Punt. There are other lands to the south, the east, the west that products are coming from. And then also with these Nubian archery and arms and iron, being able to extend that power through Canaan, through Persia, through Assyria, through Turkey, and all the way to Greece is what makes the New Kingdom Empire so grand. Now, by the time of Ramses, again, in Nefertari, right? It's not just Ramses II who builds all these great things and extends this empire, making one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. his statues are sitting right next to Nefertari, and she is sitting there equal with him, because again, at this point, the empire is split between the viceroy of Kush and the viceroy of the north, right? The viziers of the north, the viziers of the south. The empire is so great that it has to be more or less broken in two. This is not unlike the Roman Empire that we've studied a lot about, where there was the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Half of it ruled in Rome, and the other half ruled in Constantinople. It was already precedent for this when it came to Egypt, and having viziers of the north and viziers of the south, and trying to keep it all together being a grand project. But by the time we get to the 18th and the 19th dynasty, again, we have iron weapons, chariots, and what have you. So the 18th dynasty with Thutmose and Hatshepsut, the 19th dynasties with Ramses II and Nefertari. They extend their powers through all of the ancient world, and we see them united with Kush in that endeavor. But all things don't last, right? So as the 20th dynasty emerges and other pharaohs take the name Ramses, Ramses the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, the South sees these guys as illegitimate. They're ruling from the Mediterranean Delta, whereas the power base in Egypt was down in Thebes, right, in southern part. And they are more aligned in culture, in language, etc., with Nubia and Kush. So we see now more by the 20th dynasties, the 21st dynasties and all that, we see a melding of Kush and Upper Egypt, or the south, and them being in opposition to the north. As a matter of fact, when we get to Pianki, who becomes the first Nubian pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, before that he's already the high priest of Ammon before then. And as the high priest of Ammon, he is in the head of, again, basically the black church. And as the power base in the Mediterranean calls down there for the collection of taxes, or to work on or govern over monument building or whatever, the high priest of Ammon in Thebes says, no, you have no power here. So again, we have the third intermediate period where Lower Egypt and Southern Egypt are governed by two different people. And so Thebes is now governed by Kush, instead of Thebes being the conquerors of Kush, right? Under Hatshepsut, under Ramses, Thebes is the powers in Thebes over the African interior in Kush. But by the time we get to the 20th century, it flips. 20th dynasty, it flips. That now Thebes needs Kush to come and intervene to stop the subjugation of the north. And Pianki, even before he's a pharaoh, is the high priest of becomes the high priest of Amun, and also basically the king of Kush. Installs himself as that. So after Kashta, we have by the 8th century BC, the new Kushite kingdom emerged from Napata region of the Upper Dongola Reach. The first Napatan king, Alara, dedicated his sister to the cult of Amun and rebuilt the Kawa temple, while temples were also rebuilt at Jebel Barkel and Kerma. So as the Egyptian power is waning, as it's moving further north, power in Nubian, in Upper Nubia, in Lower Nubia, the Wawat, in those sections that border Egypt, become stronger and stronger and stronger. So Pianki, we know, starts off as the high priest of Amun, but then he comes up with Nubian armies to conquer all of Egypt, right? And not just all of Egypt. The plan is to keep the empire together. Egypt is taxing, when we say empire, we mean several provinces, and they're taxing Libya, Palestine, Assyria, the Hittites, etc. And how do we control all of that. Pianki comes up, but he's ruling from Napata. Napata is all the way down around the third, fourth cataract. So from that area in the African interior where you can't come, right, or at least that's the idea, that you can't even reach me to defeat me, we can tax the rest of the more or less known planet at that time. And you'll even see that our first example of Nubian matriarchy and how it's misunderstood comes from the fact that Najmet, there's a woman named Najmet, and she's entirely venerated as the mother of the king. The mother of the king. And for some reason, Egyptologists don't believe that, or don't seem to believe that is a important title, that is just, oh, it's happenstance, she happened to be the mother of the king, where it's really that the being mother of the king also means mother of the nation. And why do I believe that? Because it seems clear that Najmet is the wife, it was one of Pianki's wives, which would make him, once Pianki takes over the country, would make her eligible to be the next queen mother, and that she seemed to be appointed as such, and that she was then the mother of Herihor. Herihor becomes the high priest of Amun after Pianki. But then here's the important part. There's a relief or a painting of Herihor with Najmet and a bunch of children, and the assumption of almost all Egyptologists is, wait a minute, how can he be Najmet's son and married to a Najmet? Either it was incestual, or there's two Najmets. Well, both of those are kind of you got to work to get those, right? It leaves open questions. Well, if it's two Najmets, they don't know which one, where did this one come from versus where did that come from? If it's incestual, again, how do these highly intelligent people govern through incestual relationships? That doesn't make any sense. But what makes more sense is that, again, the queen mother of Pianki being one who starts a new dynasty, his wife, Najmet, being the new queen mother of the nation, then has a son, Herihor, who becomes ruler before the age of majority. She is pictured with him and perhaps all of the other princes and princesses that would possibly be eligible. That would be, to me, seems a very natural interpretation, but when they see Herihor and Najmet together, it has to be man and wife. In my view, again, if we understand matrilineality in Africa, I could even be wrong about it being queen, mother, and son. It could be they could be mother, sister, and brother. Right, but there has to be a woman in the monarchy. I mean, as a royal, in some way or form. So the idea that it's that there's one Najmet that is the daughter. I'm sorry, is the wife, and there's another Najmet that's the mother. I think we can do away with that by just acknowledging that as the queen mother, she has every right, and it's somewhat kind of natural for her to be depicted with her son as the monarch, as the two of them will reflect the male and female rulers of the country until he reaches majority, if he reaches majority. And it could be such that the sons and the other children presented are those that would also be eligible, that she would certify as eligible if in case Herihor does not make it to majority. And the interesting thing about that is, after we're talking about who becomes the high priest of Amun, when we talk about being who's the next pharaoh, Pianki is succeeded not by his son immediately. He's succeeded by Shabaka, his brother. And again, if this happened in Europe or in Asia, often the question would be, wow, did Shabaka usurp Pianki? Did he kill his brother and take the throne like Scar and Mufasa or something like that? That's what's almost always presented when one brother takes the throne from the next. It makes for a great story, makes for very salaciousness, but that's typically not what happened. what typically happens is Pianki dies, and the next ruler again has to be born of the royal woman. So the Pianki's mother, right, to the extent she is still recognized as the queen mother, would be able to certify who amongst her sons are eligible for an elect to be elected by the Council of State. I probably should emphasize that even more, that again, that these royal sons or even royal women are selected and certified, but then they're basically elected by a council of the state to become the new ruler. And we'll see that in a second. I know you think that's probably exaggerating, but we'll show you. So Pianki dies. Shabaka, his brother, takes the throne, not his son. And he does have a son, because as we're going to see, and the thing about Shabaka, I just want to mention Shabaka because Shabaka, we talked about law enforcement in Egypt, and I just want to make sure we mention this part. This is from Herodotus. Whenever any man of the Egyptians committed any transgression, he would never put him to death, but he gave sentence upon each man according to the greatness of the wrongdoing, appointing them to work at throwing up an embankment before the city from whence each man came of those who committed wrong. Thus the cities were made higher still than before. So that's interesting that instead of the death, so Shabaka is basically credited as being the first monarch in the world to abolish the death penalty, right? And then to have a schedule of penalties of hard labor or what have you, and labor that is more efficient, that actually created and made the cities safer. So these were the criminals that are basically tearing down the city, but your punishment is to create embankments and walls that protect the city. So it's a novel way to govern that's credited with Shabaka. But then after Shabaka, who becomes the pharaoh is Shabiku. Right, this little known person, not very famous, didn't do much, but he's Pianki's son. So it doesn't go from Pianki to Shabiku, it goes from Pianki to Shabaka to Shabiku. Right, so it eventually gets to Pianki's son, right? But not as a right of first son, as a right of those born of queen mothers and royal sisters, true Nubians, true Wakandians, for sure, right? Mother's baby, papa's maybe. So we know that they are true to the game, that they are from the state. And then last after that came Taharka. And here we have, listen to this quote again about Taharka being elected. Taharka states, I was brought from Nubia amongst the royal brothers that his majesty had brought. As I was with him, he liked me more than all his brothers and all his children, so that he distinguished me. I won the heart of the nobles and was loved by all. It was only after the hawk had flown to heaven that I received the crown in Memphis. Okay? So Taharka becomes the king, but not out of a right, out of being the first male born, but out of being certified, presumably by the queen mothers and whatnot, and then by being chosen or at least acquiesced to by the Council of State. Again, we know that queen mothers can change. They can it can pass from mother to daughter. Mothers could be adopt their sons' wives as daughters to then pass down to the queen mothers. And then when it comes to elections, it could be the Council of State, the priesthood, the viziers, the nomarchs. All of these folks could be part of the Council of State, and the Council of State could have great power or could be weak at times. So we know of their existence. We can't certify that at all times it operated in these particular fashions, but what we can certify is we don't see examples of this anywhere else in the world, right? Especially not with the ubiquity here, right? Okay, so this is the 25th dynasty, again, the Nubian Empire that rules almost the entire quote-unquote known world from Greece to almost Kenya, and they rule it from Napata. But eventually, after 100 years of their rule in around 650 BC, The Assyrians come down from the north. Here they're called a Semitic people, but this is the first time but I guess you could call them near white or whatever you want to call it. But Assyrians, Asiatics, then the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans come and they take over northern Egypt, right? The Mediterranean Egypt. They also take over, by taking over northern Egypt, they're also taking over basically where the Suez Canal is now, right? The Red Sea, right? And by controlling the Red Sea, they can get their goods out to Asia, right? Now, black folks or Africans are still trying to control Thebes, the southern part of Egypt, because there's a road that leads from Thebes also to the Red Sea. There's also ports that we're going to establish called on the southern part of Adulis. We'll talk about that next when we talk about Axum and the kingdom of Saba, and whether those ports were controlled again by Meroe. How far did the Meroitic Empire go? We talk about it north, but how far south does it go, right? Because if the further south it goes, the further we get to the East African coastline. And once we get there, that's where it opens up to Persia, India, Sri Lanka, and we know by the 3rd century AD all the way to China. So as the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks and Romans take over northern Egypt, the Pharaonic, they don't really care for the Pharaonic tradition other than by name. The Kushite Empire takes over the full Pharaonic tradition. And as a matter of fact, when you hear about tomb raiders, it's often accused that basically the Kushite rulers were basically trying to get the pharaohs and all those relics and whatnot that were established in Egypt to the south, because they were being exploited by the North for improper purposes. So King Aspelta, there's a statue of him in 620 to 580 BC. We know that from that period forward, over 200 pyramids are created to house the remains of the rulers of Kush from 600 BC all the way to 350 AD. Pharaonic culture, the insignias, the gods, and all that, under again a Nubian style, continues in Kush. A hiccup occurs around 3rd century BC when a king called, the Greeks called Ergomenes. Ergomenes, where the African name is probably Arkamani. We'll talk about that name Amani, how it shows up almost everywhere in Africa after this. But Ergomenes or Akamani was impeached. He was basically too far along line with the Greeks. There was not enough wealth in the kingdom. Things had failed, and so the priests of Ammon, who basically were still cited in Napata, while Ergomenes and the kings, the political center, was in Meroe. They impeached him. He ordered him to kill himself, right? That he was no longer effective, that he needed to leave office so that they could appoint some other eligible prince who was the son of a royal sister or the son of the queen mother, and appoint them as a new king. So basically, Killmonger, the African Killmonger, his name was Ergomenes. And the reason why he is definitely seemed to be a Killmonger is because instead of accepting the judgment of the Council of State, he did what? He had all of the priests of Ammon executed. It happens. So even though the ritual of king killing, the ritual of impeachment, is ubiquitous throughout Africa, became ubiquitous throughout Africa for over the next 1,000 to 2,000 years thereafter, and is still practiced to this day in small kingdoms within Africa. Ergomenes basically turned it on its head, and instead of accepting the judgment, centered control more greatly within the political monarchy, political establishments, and the wealthy, by killing the priests of Ammon, and then also moving the government and establishing more in Meroe. So we have this concept of matrilineality when it comes to power succession. We have this election, we have certification and all this. But let's also go back and close this out with the queen monarch, the matriarchs of Nubia, the Candaces. So if all you name Candace, again, your name is royal, right? It literally means queen. The Kandakis, the Candaces, known by Egyptian, Greek, Roman scholars, talked about with utter veneration. Know that Alexander the Great conquers Egypt for the Greeks. And again, it's usually the northern part, the delta, that falls first, and the south is contested over. And so as Alexander, and remember, the gold is not in Egypt. The gold, even if you conquer Egypt, you haven't conquered the gold mines because they're further south. There's also the iron and all that stuff. So if you're conquering Egypt because you think that's the source of the gold, you haven't gone far enough. Now, by conquering Egypt, you have conquered the routes to the rest of the world. So now Nubian or Kushite gold, Nubian or Kushite iron can't get to the Mediterranean. It can't get to Palestine. It can't get to Turkey. It can't get to Persia, at least through the land route anymore, if someone else controls Egypt. So now, instead of being able to march out and sell my stuff for whatever it's worth, I have to give it to this middleman who gets rich. So I'm bottled up, unless what? I can find another route out through the Red Sea. So before even that happens, Alexander the Great conquers northern Egypt, but he keeps coming south. If he could have conquered Nubia, he would have. So he goes that far, but then he runs into one of the Candaces, and she stops him cold, right? And we don't know the name of which Candace. This is when the name Candace is basically first invoked in the stories of the Greeks, that a Greek warrior queen named Candace. We learn later that that's just what the name of the queens were. But Queen Candace, the very first one, repels Alexander the Great, this conqueror of so many territories in one of the world's greatest empires, was repelled by a black woman from Nubia, Queen Candace. And it doesn't stop there. After the Greeks leave, the Romans try to do the very same thing, but they think they're going to get even further. And so Caesar Augustus establishes himself. Now, they do establish themselves even further down in Egypt, all the way down into Thebes, and perhaps even into Wawat, where the gold is. But that pisses off Queen Amani Reines. Let me read this portion. Neil McGregor refers to Strabel's account of a fierce, one-eyed Queen Candace capturing a series of Roman forts in southern 25 BC Egypt. Her army returned with a bronze depiction of Augustus's head taken from a statue of the Roman Empire. She then buried the severed head of the glorious Augustus beneath the steps of a temple dedicated to victory. Great story, right? It's true. The head, found in Moreau in 1912, now resides in the British Museum. Following this event, negotiations began. The Meroites sent mediators to Augustus, who was then in Samos, and in the year 2120 BC, a peace treaty was concluded. It was strikingly favorable to the Meroites in that the southern part of the 30-mile strip, including Primus, I don't know where that is, was evacuated by the Romans, and the Meroites were exempted from having to pay tribute to the emperor. So in both instances where the Greeks and the Romans, the great empires of the great empire builders of antiquity of the Mediterranean world, they were both stopped by black women when they tried to conquer Nubia and bring Nubia within those empires by making it pay taxes. We're not paying taxes, DR. Right? So the Kushites paid taxes to the Egyptians when Kemet was preeminent, but not to the Assyrians and not to the Greeks or the Romans. Now, it's not perfect. I believe there is enough evidence to show that the Persians that there was a certain tax upon Nubians to provide a certain amount of elephants each year to the Persian Empire, right? At the time of Herodotus, around 611 BC. So under that, you could make the argument that under Persian Egypt, for that small period of time when Persia was running basically the whole world of antiquity, that the Nubian Empire, Nubia may have come under their reign, because we do have evidence of a requirement that they are to send a certain amount of elephants to the king of Persia every year. However, it still seems like that was a very slight tax. Didn't seem like it was very onerous at the time. But we do know that when it came to Greece, when it came to Romans, they were both stopped by the Queen Candaces. The arrangement, that peace treaty between the Romans and Nubia continued until the end of the 3rd century AD, with relations between Meroe and Roman Egypt remaining generally peaceful during this time. And during this time, we have several kings that I won't name, but I will name the queens that also took the throne between the 2nd century BCE and year 370. Queen Shenaktiketi, Queen Amani Reines, Queen Amani Shaketo, Queen Nawadimak, Queen Amani Tori, Queen Amani Tenamid, Queen Melekarabar, and Queen Lakidamani. Queen Lakidamani. And you'll note how many monarchs of other sub-Saharan states are named again Mani, whether and even we'll leave that there. So the kingdom of Kush and its role as one of the world's great empires of antiquity lasts all the way up until the year 370, when one of its southern provinces, Ethiopia or Axum, right, out of the city of Adulis, comes up. King Azana then comes up and conquers Meroe and brings Meroe under the Axumite Empire. Next episode, we're going to talk about this Axumite Empire. We're going to talk about, where is Ethiopia? Does Ethiopia refer to Axum? Does it refer to ancient Nubia? How far did Ethiopia extend? Did it extend over the southern Arabian Peninsula to a place called Saba? In other words, Sheba. In other words, was the Queen of Sheba, Queen Makeda, a Nubian? Was she Ethiopian? Or, on the other hand, as Asiatics and Eurocentric scholars would argue, did Saba and the Shebeans come from South Arabia and conquer and colonize Africa on through Axum? There's still a debate about this. There are still scholars who are angered by Ethiopia claiming the name they believe belongs to the Sudan, and that Ethiopia itself belongs to the West Asian or the Arabian world, where on the counter argument by the Emperor Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie I, who chose the name Ethiopia to connote the idea that Ethiopia and those that belong to northeastern Africa were part of the Kushite Empire, even back in antiquity, and that the term Ethiopia, although assigned to that region, should extend over that region and the rest of the Sudan. That would give us a fuller, more complete context of what the term Ethiopia meant when it was used by Herodotus and the other Greek and Roman scholars of the day. We're going to explore that in more detail on episode 12. We'll talk about Queen Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, Axum, and the Ethiopian Empire that takes over as the preeminent state in East Africa in 370. We'll talk about the Zanj, Zanzibar, hopefully all the way down to Sofala, and then the Zanj people as personified by Al-Jahiz, an Iraqi African who was one of Islam's most venerated scholars. So these are the places we're going. We'll talk about Carthage. We're going to talk about Nok, Ghana. There's so many things more to discuss. I'm glad you were along for this this episode where we at least could bring some of the concepts that we are discussing and give them a more practical application, so that again, under that through Wakanda, we can distinguish between fact and reality, or fact and myth, when it comes to how Egyptian states were structured. That Killmonger would not have been eligible for the throne because although he is the king's son, he is not born of a royal Wakandan woman. Right? And that there would not have been a test of strength, that there would have been a certification by the Queen Mother of who is eligible to be the next king, and then an election or selection by the Council of State, and that even if Killmonger, who did not have a royal sister, or who would have had to appoint a royal sister or his own Queen Mother or a queen of his own, that he also would have been eligible for impeachment by the Council of State, otherwise known as king killing. So the Dora Milaje would not have been entirely powerless to they would not have been entirely subservient to the king just for the nature of subservience, just for the nature of power and authority, that they would have been able to join up with the Queen Mother and the other priests of the state and ministers of the state to impeach Killmonger and request that he kill himself. Now, again, like Ergomenes, he probably could have refused and killed them, but those are the options that were up to them, including the idea that he wasn't eligible even in the first place. So thank you for joining us. I hope you join us again for episode 12. As I mentioned all the time, please educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, stop unduly criticizing each other. Let's accumulate great amounts of human, social, political, and financial capital. Hotep.